I never imagined a betrayal so profound would come from the very people I loved the most. Yet, there it was, the proof flashing across my phone screen, messages describing me as nothing more than a family ATM, and mocking me for being too stupid to realize it. Each cruel word seared itself into my mind, shattering the illusions I once held about my own flesh and blood. I had always believed that families, no matter how flawed, shielded each other from the world's cynicism. Little did I know, I needed protection from them. This is my story of heartbreak, revelation, and a fierce, calculated revenge. From the day I was born, I had no doubt in my mind that my parents and older brother loved me. As the youngest child, I was the one they teased but also coddled. I grew up in a modest suburban home with a small backyard and neighbours who knew us by name. My father, Lawrence, worked long hours at an auto repair shop to provide for the family. My mother, Rita, often had part-time gigs housekeeping, selling homemade crafts at local fairs to help make ends meet. My older brother, James, was the golden boy, the one whose jokes brought my parents to uproarious laughter, whose achievements were paraded proudly in front of relatives and neighbours alike. I, Eliana, was the quiet, studious kid who helped with chores and watched her brother get away with murder. And for a long time, that was all right. After all, James was the star, and I didn't mind supporting him from the sidelines. While he played baseball after school, I'd help Mum with housework or run errands for Dad. While he went to weekend parties, I stacked shelves at a local bookstore for extra cash. Our parents offered only a vague gratitude, believing that as a girl, I was more domestic or sensible. But I took pride in my responsibilities. That sense of duty, however, made me blind to how easily it could be exploited. Money was never abundant in our household. My parents worked themselves to the bone, and arguments over bills were a normal background noise during my childhood. I remember seeing the tension in their eyes whenever an unexpected expense arose. Even then, I felt compelled to help. As soon as I was old enough, I applied for a part-time job. My father's nod of approval was all I needed. In truth, I wanted to lighten their load. I never anticipated that my willingness to give would someday be weaponized against me. The moment I turned 16, I started depositing portions of my paycheck into the family's account. My mother would give me a sad, grateful smile each time. Looking back, I can't recall a single instance when they said, "No, Eliana, keep this for yourself," or "Are you sure you're okay giving us this money?" But at the time, I never questioned it. I believed it was my role to support them. A sense of pride swelled within me every payday, even though I noticed that my own savings never seemed to grow. Then came college applications. While my parents congratulated me on my acceptance letters, they also reminded me how expensive tuition would be. I didn't want to burden them, so I applied for scholarships, took out student loans, and continued working. I rented a small studio apartment near campus to have some independence and to save on the cost of commuting. That only intensified my hustle. Between classes, I worked as a librarian's assistant and sometimes did night shifts at a local diner. Still, whenever my parents called with urgent pleas, "We're behind on rent this month, can you spare a bit?" Or "Dad's medication isn't covered, can you help us out?" I wired them money without hesitation. James rarely contributed. After finishing high school, he decided college wasn't for him. He hopped from job to job, living at home rent-free while our parents covered his expenses. If I felt a twinge of resentment, I quickly buried it. They needed my help more than my anger. Family was family, after all. Those early warning signs were subtle. My mother started making light jokes about how I was such a soft touch, how I'd give them the shirt off my back if they asked. My father once told me, with a laugh, that he was grateful one of his kids came with a built-in piggy bank. James would call, not to ask how I was doing, but to mention a new pair of shoes he wanted or a weekend trip he planned, ending with a casual, "Hey, sis, you think you could spot me some cash?" I never saw the malice lurking behind these jokes, or how they chipped away at me bit by bit. I assumed my family was simply leaning on me because I was dependable. That notion somehow became my identity. Eliana, the dependable daughter. Eliana, the stable presence. Eliana, the one who never says no. Even when I struggled with tight finances at college, missing out on certain experiences my peers enjoyed, I consoled myself with the thought that I was doing something noble. Perhaps I was naive, but a part of me believed that every selfless act would eventually be recognized and reciprocated. I was so wrong. In my junior year of college, tragedy struck. My father got into a car accident on his way home from work. Though the damage to the car was extensive, thankfully he survived with non-fatal injuries: broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and a concussion. My mother, already working 2 part-time jobs, felt the strain of providing emotional and physical support. James, still living at home, shrugged off the need to help with finances, rationalizing that he wasn't responsible for Dad's hospital bills or therapy costs. That left me. My father's insurance covered some of the medical costs, but not all. My mother called me in tears, explaining how expensive everything was, how bills were piling up. I dropped my classes for that semester and took on extra shifts. My plan was to return to college once my father recovered. It hurt me, giving up on my education, but it felt like the only logical move. If I didn't help them, who would? During that time, they praised me for my sacrifice. My father used to say, "Eliana's the real backbone of the family." James, meanwhile, still managed to go out with friends and buy new gadgets. My mother would sometimes exasperatedly say, "I wish your brother could be more like you," but never pressed him to pitch in. Even so, I paid it no mind. My father was injured and I needed to help. Nothing else mattered. After my father's condition stabilized, I managed to return to school, albeit a year behind my peers. But my troubles were far from over. My mother kept calling, explaining how the accident forced Dad to switch to a less physically demanding role, which meant a pay cut. Each request from them was urgent and overshadowed by a sense of looming crisis. By this point, I was working 2 jobs: an on-campus position in the mornings and a barista gig on weekends. Money was tight, but somehow, I still managed to send funds home. I remember lying awake some nights, feeling the pressure bearing down on me like a heavyweight perched on my chest. My father's praises had evaporated, replaced by something that felt like entitlement. James had moved out briefly with some friends, but kept returning home whenever he was between jobs, draining more resources. Each phone call from my parents felt like a bill collector, demanding payment. I was exhausted. And still, I told myself, they're my family. They've done so much for me. I owe them. But as the demands became more frequent and the thanks more perfunctory, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout in my mind. Was this truly normal? The revelation came in the most mundane way possible. My brother, James, was visiting me at my apartment, whining about how our parents were suffocating him with responsibilities, which I found ironic, considering I was the one paying most of their bills. He wanted to crash for a few days because he felt stressed out. Though I was irritated, I agreed, hoping maybe I could talk sense into him, or at least figure out if something was going on at home that I didn't know about. He fell asleep on my couch after rummaging through my fridge. That's when his phone buzzed. The screen lit up, showing a notification from a group chat named Fam Chat. Thinking it was something urgent about Dad's health, my father's injuries sometimes caused flare-ups, I decided to peek. And that's how I stumbled on the thread that changed everything. I shouldn't have looked, but a force beyond me compelled my fingers to swipe. I expected mundane family chatter. Instead, I saw messages from Mom, Dad, and James, talking about me as though I were an object rather than a person. The lines blurred before my eyes. "Dad, I need her to pay the electricity bill this month. Don't mention I just bought that new tool set. Mom, don't worry. She's too soft-hearted to question. Eliana is basically our ATM at this point. James, lol, she's too stupid to realize it. She thinks she's helping, but I'm using half her money for my gaming PC." The shock rippled through my body, leaving me numb. My family, my flesh and blood, openly mocked me, calling me a family ATM and laughing behind my back. They orchestrated ways to squeeze more money out of me without me catching on. Every single conversation I'd had with them in the past few months took on a grotesque new light. I wish I could say I confronted James immediately, but I was too stunned. My throat constricted, and tears welled in my eyes. I carefully laid the phone back on the coffee table, sank onto the floor, and tried not to sob loud enough to wake him. My mind reeled with questions I couldn't answer. How long had they seen me as a meal ticket rather than a beloved daughter and sister? How could they laugh about it so casually? I remember inching away from the phone as though it were infected with a disease, something that had just destroyed my naive worldview. For years, I'd accepted my role as caretaker, proud to be dependable. But in one horrifying moment, I realized I was more of a resource to them than a child or sibling. All my efforts, all my sacrifices, had been met with scorn. Behind my back, adrenaline coursed through me, and tears gave way to a chilling sense of betrayal. I wanted to scream, to shake James awake, and demand an explanation, but I felt paralyzed. A single phrase from that chat echoed relentlessly in my mind. She's too stupid to realize it. Eventually, the first picked myself up from the floor and tiptoed to my bedroom. My fingers trembled as I fumbled for my phone. I forwarded screenshots of the chat to my own email address. My thoughts whirled. I need proof. If I confront them now, they might try to delete everything and deny it. Once the screenshots were safe, I stared at the sleeping form of my brother on my couch. He was snoring softly, oblivious to the emotional wreckage he'd inflicted. My heart pounded, torn between heartbreak and fury. I wanted to banish him from my apartment, but a calmer voice in my head told me to be strategic. If I lashed out blindly, they would bury the evidence, twist the story, and paint me as the irrational one. No, I needed a plan. So I crawled into bed but couldn't sleep. White-hot rage simmered beneath every breath I took. I had to be cunning about my next move. What they had done wasn't just petty gossip. It was a systematic plan to exploit me. That night, the old version of me, the naive, endlessly giving daughter, died. In her place emerged a person who understood the necessity of revenge, or, at the very least, justice. The next morning, James woke up complaining about a hangover, rummaged through my kitchen for breakfast, and then casually asked if I had any spare cash for him to buy some groceries. Suppressing the urge to scream, I forced a tight smile. "Sure," I replied. "Let me just check my account." He blinked, perhaps a little surprised at my immediate agreement, but said nothing. I pretended to type on my phone. Internally, I was stoking my anger, reminding myself to keep up the charade. When I handed him a $20 bill, he grinned and gave me a half hug. "I'll pay you back," he muttered, and I almost laughed at the blatant lie. Yet, before he left, I planted a seed of my own. "Hey, I was thinking I might need to move to a bigger place soon. My job is going well. Maybe if my finances improve, I can help out even more." The spark in his eyes betrayed his excitement. Of course, that promise of more money would make them salivate. But it was all part of my plan to get them to show their true colors, to gather enough evidence, and to orchestrate a public reckoning. Over the following weeks, I played my part with meticulous care. I resumed regular phone calls with my parents, feigning concern about their financial woes. I even offered additional help, but always insisted that any requests come through text or email, explaining that I was super busy with work and might forget if it's not in writing. They complied without hesitation. Soon, I had a neatly archived list of messages, requests for rent money, for new appliances, for James's latest emergency, all peppered with manipulative lines like, "You know we'd do the same for you if we could," or "Don't you love your family?" Behind the scenes, I saved everything. It was painful to see my father and mother stoop to such levels, but each new text steeled my resolve. My father asked for an expensive tool set one week, claiming it was crucial for his job, though their group chat suggested it was a hobby project. My mother needed urgent cash for medical bills, though there was no actual mention of what she was treating. Each time, I played the docile, loving daughter, responding with, "Of course!" Anything to help. They never sensed my internal transformation. Meanwhile, I carefully monitored the group chat through James's phone whenever he crashed at my place. I found moments like when he'd shower or nap to open his phone. I discovered entire threads of them laughing at my generosity, calling me gullible or naive. I even saw references to times they had lied about Dad's health issues to get more funds out of me. Each screenshot felt like a dagger in my heart, but I compiled them, naming the files by date and details of each lie. All that subterfuge weighed heavily on me. I needed to share the burden, so I turned to my closest friend, Melody, someone I'd known since high school. Melody was the type of friend who would come to your house at 3 in the morning if you needed help. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, I showed her snippets of the group chat, My hands were shaking as I spoke, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. She stared at the screen, her eyes filling with righteous indignation. Eliana, this is awful. I can't believe they'd treat you like this. Why are you pretending nothing's wrong? I explained my plan for a bigger confrontation, how I wanted to expose the truth in such a way that they couldn't deny or spin it. Melody nodded, gripping my hand. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you, she promised. It was the first time in weeks. I felt a sense of relief. Knowing someone else saw the unvarnished truth validated my emotions. Now that I had Melody's support, I felt emboldened. My plan crystallized. I wanted a public exposure, not out of pettiness, but to ensure they couldn't slither away from accountability. My family had always prided themselves on their squeaky clean reputation in our community. My parents, in particular, boasted about how they raised 2 perfect kids and overcame adversity. If neighbors or extended family saw what truly happened, the fallout would be immense. The opportunity presented itself when my cousin planned an engagement party. She invited the entire extended family. My parents and James were sure to attend, flaunting their image. I decided that would be my stage. I began gathering not only texts, but also forging a chronological narrative, each demand for money, each nasty remark from the group chat, cross-referenced with actual bank statements or receipts. I was building a case so ironclad that no amount of guilt-tripping or gaslighting could dismiss it. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late summer. Set in the backyard of my aunt's suburban home, it would be a day of mingling relatives, toasts, and well wishes. My aunt had asked me to help with decorations, so I arrived early. This allowed me to set up a laptop and projector in the living room, under the guise of preparing a slideshow of the couple's childhood photos. No one questioned it. After all, I was the helpful niece. The plan was to wait until after the official toasts. Then, in front of everyone, I'd play my curated slideshow. Only this would not be a typical family slideshow. It would begin with sweet memories, but climax in a reveal of all their vicious commentary about me. The texts, the jokes, the condescending remarks calling me their ATM. A part of me trembled at the thought, could I really do this to my own parents, my own brother? Yet I reminded myself that they had betrayed me in the cruelest way. They deserved to face the consequences. And more importantly, I needed closure. I wanted to reclaim my life, free from their manipulative grasp. Family members began trickling in around noon. The sun was bright, laughter and chatter filled the backyard, and the scent of barbecued meats drifted through the air. My cousin and her fiancé glowed with excitement. My parents arrived, smiling widely, as though they were the paragon of familial love. James followed them, making jokes with my uncles. I watched them from a distance, my stomach tight. Melody squeezed my hand in silent support. Throughout the afternoon, my family acted as though we were perfectly fine. My mother boasted about how proud she was of me, how I was always so giving and caring. My father nodded, wearing that familiar mask of paternal pride. James tried to borrow $20 for gas money. I played along, politely laughing, but inside, my anger simmered. Each phony word fueled my determination. Finally, as the sun dipped lower, my aunt announced it was time for speeches. Relatives gathered in the living room, balancing plates of food and cups of lemonade. My cousin thanked everyone for coming, while her fiancé spoke about how he couldn't wait to join such a loving, supportive family. I nearly choked on the irony. When the final toast ended, I stood up, clearing my throat. I've put together a little slideshow for the newly engaged couple, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just some cherished family memories and a special surprise at the end. A round of applause and curious murmurs followed. I dimmed the lights, turned on the projector, and played the first slide's childhood pictures of my cousin, family reunions at Christmas, comedic snapshots of the fiancé's youth. Laughter peppered the room. My parents and James stood near the back, arms folded, smiling politely. I caught James giving me a thumbs up. Oh, the irony, I thought. Then came the transition. I switched slides to a black screen with a single line of text. The truth behind the laughter. Confusion flickered over the crowd. My mother's brows furrowed. My father shifted uneasily. James narrowed his eyes. I clicked to the next slide, revealing screenshots of text messages between my parents and James. Messages that read, She'll give us anything we ask for, and Eliana's too stupid to realize we're just using her. Gasps rippled through the room. My aunt stepped forward, hand over her mouth, as she scanned the projected text. I pressed on, my voice trembling with equal parts rage and heartbreak. For years, I believed I was helping my family out of love. But this is what they really thought of me, a naive ATM they could exploit. I advanced the slides further, showing each screenshot in chronological order, requests for rent money under false pretenses, mocking statements about how gullible I was, and references to how they tricked me into covering my brother's leisurely lifestyle. No one in the living room moved. Eyes were glued to the screen, scanning messages that dripped with contempt. My father went pale. My mother let out a strangled, "Eliana, this is not what you think." But I ignored her, continuing to the final slides that summarized thousands of dollars I'd given them, with references to the exact manipulations they'd used to pry each sum out of me. When the final slide faded to black, a stunned silence hung in the air. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like thunder in my ears. Then the questions erupted. How could you do this to your daughter? Oh my God, is this real? Rita, Lawrence, you told us you were struggling. This is how you repay her? Relatives spun around, confronting my parents and James. My father tried to speak, but words failed him. My mother began to cry, reaching out to me. Eliana, please, we never meant to hurt you. We were just, stop, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Don't insult my intelligence any further. I have evidence of everything. My gaze flickered to James. He seemed trapped, shoulders slumped, eyes darting as though searching for an escape. It was my aunt who demanded an explanation. Lawrence, Rita, James, say something. Is any of this fabricated? They exchanged guilty glances, but none of them could muster a defense. The weight of the truth pressed down like a hammer. I took that moment to stand firm. I've spent years sacrificing for you, and all you've done is mock me behind my back. This ends now. I'm done. My father, stung by public humiliation, finally found his voice. You had no right to do this here. You're tearing this family apart, he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at me. Some of our relatives gasped at the outburst. My mother nodded tearfully, adding, "This was supposed to be a celebration. How could you hijack it with your petty grievances?" Petty grievances. My voice rose. Anger coursed through my veins like liquid fire. I supported you, financially, emotionally gave up parts of my life to help you when Dad had that accident. And this entire time you were laughing about how easy it was to manipulate me. Don't you dare call my feelings petty. James tried to intervene, stepping forward. Sis, come on. We were just venting. It's not like we meant all of it. I cut him off. You literally joked about being able to buy your gaming PC because I was too stupid to realize how you tricked me out of money. That's not venting, that's cruelty. The living room erupted into chaos as relatives voiced their outrage or tried to calm everyone down. My cousin was in tears, upset that her engagement party had taken such a turn, but also clearly horrified at what she'd learned about our parents. An uncle stormed toward my father, yelling about the shame he'd brought upon the family. My mother sobbed, clinging to a nearby chair for support, but no one stepped forward to comfort her. The empathy that might have once been there was overshadowed by betrayal. I stood near the projector, breathing heavily. Despite the swirl of anger, I felt a strange relief. I'd carried this burden of their secrets for too long. Now it was all out in the open. My legs trembled from the adrenaline, but Melody appeared at my side, gently placing her hand on my shoulder. You did it, she whispered. In that moment, the reality of what I had done sank in. There would be no undoing this reveal, no going back to the old dynamics. My life would change irrevocably, but that was exactly what I wanted. My father, still humiliated, tried to approach me, but a wall of relatives blocked his path. He glared over their shoulders, shouting, "You've always been dramatic, Eliana. I can't believe you'd tarnish our name like this." I refused to cower. I've been dramatic? You lied about medical bills, job setbacks, and everything else just to get money out of me. If anyone tarnished this family name, it's you, both of you. He hissed between clenched teeth. We are your parents. You owe us respect. I felt a surge of defiance stiffen my spine. Respect is earned, not owed. And you lost any claim to it the moment you turned me into a punchline in your sick private jokes. Across the room, James stood quietly, looking more like a chastised child than the brash brother I knew. Our eyes met for a split second, and I saw something like remorse flicker across his face. But it was too little, too late. The damage was done. The engagement party dispersed in utter disarray. My aunt tried to salvage some dignity, apologizing to her daughter's guests, but the tension was unshakable. My parents and James left early, storming out under a barrage of disapproving stares. I helped my cousin with the last of the cleanup, apologizing for overshadowing her celebration. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "I'm glad you stood up for yourself, even if the timing was rough." Melody offered to drive me back to my apartment. I collapsed into her passenger seat, feeling the weight of the day pressing me down. "How do you feel?" she asked once we hit the highway. "Relieved and terrified," I admitted. My voice wavered. I've spent my entire life trying to please them, and now I've basically blown up that relationship. But at least the truth is out. I don't have to pretend anymore. Melody nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. "You did the right thing. Sometimes you have to break things down before you can rebuild something healthy, even if it's just for yourself." Over the next few days, I received an onslaught of phone calls, texts, and voicemails. Some relatives reached out to express support, telling me how brave I was. Others scolded me, saying I should have handled it privately. A few said nothing, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the drama. My parents and James bombarded my phone with messages, ranging from rage to apologies. My mother begged me to come home so we could talk it through. My father demanded I issue a retraction of sorts, claiming that I'd misconstrued the messages. James's messages were the most pitiful, laced with half-hearted apologies. "Sis, I'm sorry. We never meant to hurt you that bad. Let's just fix this." But I ignored most of them. For the first time in years, I prioritized my own mental well-being over their chaos. Melody stayed with me for a few nights in case any of them decided to show up at my doorstep. Thankfully, they didn't perhaps too proud or too ashamed to face me in person. I'd love to say I felt free and empowered from that day on, but the truth was more complicated. Guilt clawed at me, whispering that I'd torn apart my own family. Did I really need to do it so publicly? Could I have confronted them privately and avoided the spectacle? These questions haunted my sleepless nights. My nightmares were filled with my mother's tear-streaked face, my father's furious accusations, and James's betrayal. I woke up shaking, tears dampening my pillow, uncertain if I'd done the right thing. But then, I'd reread those screenshots, my father calling me too stupid, my mother telling James to keep lying to me, and that guilt would recede, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. I realized I had to navigate this duality, mourning the loss of the family I thought I had, while recognizing they never truly existed in the loving form I believed. It was a hollow comfort, but it grounded me. In the weeks following the dramatic confrontation, I found myself leaning more on friends than I ever had before. Co-workers at the bookstore noticed my distant expression and offered to cover shifts if I needed a mental health day. My boss quietly slipped a supportive note in my mailbox, reminding me that I had a family in the workplace too. Melody cooked dinner for me, invited me to watch silly movies, and gave me the space to cry on her shoulder without judgment. I also rediscovered some old friendships from high school that I'd lost touch with. People reached out on social media, having heard the story through the grapevine, and offered me unconditional support. One old friend, Tasha, recounted how she'd been estranged from her own father for years, explaining that while it was painful, it allowed her to grow independently. The sense of not being alone in this was crucial. All this genuine kindness from non-relatives made me realize that family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes, it's about those who stand by you without hidden agendas or mocking laughter. And I promised myself I would nurture these bonds with care and gratitude. It soon dawned on me that cutting emotional ties wasn't enough. Over the years, I'd become so entangled with my family's finances, paying bills, transferring money, even co-signing certain accounts that I needed a clean break there, too. I decided to consult a lawyer, a friend of Melody's mother. At first, I felt silly, thinking, this is my family. Do I really need legal measures? But after seeing how easily they'd used me, I wasn't willing to take chances. I gathered all the paperwork, bank statements, any contracts or co-signed documents, and of course, the digital evidence of their manipulations. The lawyer listened to my story and nodded sympathetically. "We can definitely separate your financial liabilities from theirs," she said. "It'll take some effort, but we can ensure they no longer have access to your money or credit." Hearing this gave me a sense of empowerment. It was another layer of the fortress I was building around myself. My parents might still try to guilt trip or emotionally manipulate me, but at least they wouldn't be able to reach into my pocket anymore. As time passed, my parents' messages shifted in tone. Rage gave way to pleading, and eventually, my mother left a voicemail, weeping and saying how much she missed her daughter. She claimed they had no idea how their words would hurt me so deeply. My father wrote a long text, claiming that while they joked crudely, it was never intended to be malicious, just a way to vent about financial stress. James sent me repeated apologies, telling me he felt like garbage for his part in all of this and wanted a chance to make it right. I listened to that voicemail alone in my apartment, tears rolling down my cheeks. Part of me ached to believe them, to wipe the slate clean. But the memory of those group chat messages kept replaying, fueling my skepticism. I responded with a simple statement: "I'm willing to talk in a structured environment with a mediator present. Otherwise, I can't speak to you right now." It felt harsh, but boundaries were crucial. They balked at the suggestion. A mediator? That sounded too formal, too public. But after a week, James tentatively agreed, followed by my mother. My father's agreement came last, likely driven by a desire to salvage the family's reputation. We found a counselor who specialized in family disputes. The first session was tense. My parents walked in, eyes puffy and tired. James couldn't meet my gaze. The counselor explained the ground rules: no shouting, no insults, and an equal chance for everyone to speak. My mother began in tears, talking about how our family had always been close-knit and that the accident years ago had drained them financially. She claimed the group chat was just a misguided outlet for stress. My father chimed in, apologizing for his harsh words, but also trying to shift blame onto the situation. "We were desperate, Eliana. We never meant to degrade you." I listened, arms folded. "But you did degrade me," I said quietly. "You mocked me. You lied to me. You manipulated me into thinking you were in crisis when you weren't. None of that is justified by stress." The counselor nodded, gently prodding them to address my accusations directly. James admitted to feeling jealous of me, how I always seemed to have my life together. "I guess I wanted to tear you down a bit because I hated feeling like the inferior one," he confessed. It was the most honest thing I'd heard from him in years. Over multiple sessions, we trudged through layers of resentment and misunderstanding. My parents finally admitted that seeing me succeed financially while they struggled stoked their pride. Instead of being grateful, they channeled envy and frustration into ugly jokes. My father said he'd grown up in a household where emotional manipulation was the norm. My mother apologized, sobbing, insisting she regretted her part in the cruelty. Was it enough? I wasn't sure. I saw glimmers of real remorse, especially from James. But trust once shattered isn't easily rebuilt. Still, the counselor encouraged us to create a plan for moving forward, strict boundaries around money, open lines of communication, and a rule that any conflict be handled in therapy rather than behind my back. I tentatively agreed to keep meeting them in therapy, but made no promises about returning to the old dynamic. They had to understand that my forgiveness, if it ever came, would be slow and dependent on consistent change. Outside of therapy, I poured myself into building a life free from the lingering shadows of manipulation and guilt that once weighed me down. First, I made a triumphant return to my studies. Re-enrolling in classes, I felt an odd mix of excitement and nerves. On my first day back on campus, I half expected to be swallowed by self-doubt fears that I was too old now, too behind. But as soon as I walked into a lecture hall, a rush of determination steadied me. My thirst for knowledge had never disappeared. It had simply been buried under the constant demands of family obligations. Next came my career. My boss at the bookstore, who'd always admired my work ethic, offered me a better position with increased pay and flexible hours to accommodate my studies. It felt like a breath of fresh air, finally blowing into my life. Freed from the financial labyrinth I'd been stuck in, I was able to focus on my own goals rather than sending every spare dollar back home. I even allowed myself small luxuries, a new laptop for my coursework, an occasional dinner out with friends, guilt-free trips to coffee shops for study sessions. In tandem with school and work, I sought a place to live that felt entirely my own, no more using my parents' address or returning to that sense of old burdens. Whenever I walked through a door, I found a small but cozy apartment on the outskirts of the city. The neighbors were friendly. A couple across the hall baked cookies for me as a welcome gift, and an elderly woman downstairs greeted me each morning with a cheerful nod as she watered her plants. There was nothing extravagant about the space-peeling paint on the windowsills and a tiny kitchenette, but it felt like a sanctuary. Melody and Tasha played a pivotal role in helping me transform the apartment into a true home. We spent a few weekends scouring thrift shops for lamps, side tables, and mismatched chairs. Each time we discovered a hidden gem, a funky floor lamp, or a hand-painted ceramic vase, they squealed with delight, while I imagined how it would look in my new haven. We laughed over how I was finally allowed to pick out decor that wasn't practical or family-friendly, but purely mine. By the end of our decorating spree, the living room brimmed with soft cushions and bright rugs that made the space feel inviting and uniquely personal. Yet the biggest change wasn't physical. It was emotional. Every small step forward felt like liberation. I signed up for a painting class at a local art studio, choosing bright colors and broad strokes to explore my inner turmoil and gradual healing. I started practicing yoga, tentatively at first, just a few poses in my living room before bed. Over time, I discovered it helped calm the churning thoughts that sometimes kept me up at night, reminding me to breathe, to root myself in the present instead of lingering on old betrayals. On weekends, I even ventured into the mountains nearby for short hikes. The first time I reached a scenic overlook, heart pounding from the climb, I gazed over the valley and realized how small my old problems looked from such a height. Nature offered a perspective that therapy sessions couldn't always provide. I was allowed to be Eliana, an individual separate from her family's chaos, soaking in the sunlight and crisp air that reminded me life was bigger than the walls I once felt trapped within. James, surprisingly, made efforts to show he was changing too, or at least trying. He occasionally sent me texts about his new job hunt, how he'd gone for interviews, or how he was learning to budget instead of hitting me up for money. Once, he forwarded a screenshot of a conversation with our parents, refusing their request for cash. He added a note, "I'm done being part of the problem." I wasn't sure if I believed his resolve would hold, but it signaled progress, however fragile. Perhaps he had glimpsed the wreckage he'd helped create and wanted to distance himself from the toxic cycle. Still, I reminded myself not to let guarded hope morph into blind trust. The wounds they inflicted on me needed time to scar over, time for me to discern whether their apologies were sincere. In the interim, I savored the calm that enveloped my new existence. No frantic calls demanding money, no guilt-soaked pleas for family unity, just day-by-day living, discovering what passions I'd buried, and reclaiming them now with a fierce sense of ownership. It wasn't a picture-perfect life. There were moments when I thought about the small joys I used to share with my parents, a homemade Sunday breakfast, a family TV night that still carried a nostalgic pang. Grief would grip me at unexpected times, a random memory of Dad's old jokes, or the way Mum used to hum while cooking my favourite stew. But those memories no longer held me hostage. They coexisted with the knowledge of their deceit. And as painful as that duality felt, it also validated my choice to stand on my own. Through it all, one steadily found my voice and remembered that my worth was not tied to how much I gave to others. In forging ahead, I embraced the freedom to define my own identity, Eliana, the college student, the budding artist, the curious hiker, and the friend who would do anything for those who truly cared about her. The caretaker role was still in my nature, but now it was tempered by discernment, a recognition that kindness should not come at the cost of self-destruction. This version of me slowly blooming from a tumultuous past was stronger, a testimony to survival and self-discovery, and she would never again allow herself to be an ATM for anyone's twisted amusement. Over the ensuing months, the cautious equilibrium we'd established, sporadic therapy sessions, reluctant apologies, and the halting efforts to mend deep fractures gave me a semblance of peace. Yet beneath that fragile calm, I sensed unfinished business. My parents still harbored resentment for my public exposure of their behavior, and I carried doubts about whether their remorse was genuine or simply a bid to save face. Each therapy session concluded with promises of improved communication and respect for boundaries, but the question lingered, could a family built on deception ever truly heal? I remember one particular session in stark detail. The counselor began with the usual pleasantries, inviting each of us to share updates about the week. My father spoke first, gruffly admitting he'd been laid off again. "It's just a tough market," he muttered. My mother patted his arm, eyes darting to me, as though expecting I'd instantly volunteer to help. But I stayed silent, my hands folded in my lap, heart pounding. This was the test. Would they slip back into old habits and ask me to bail them out? Would my father once again frame his hardship as my responsibility? He didn't. He stopped short, pressing his lips together as though restraining himself. The counselor nodded, gesturing for him to continue. Finally, my father exhaled heavily and said, "We're managing. I've got some leads. I'm not looking for money from anyone right now." It was a small statement, barely more than a single sentence, but the weight it lifted from my chest was astounding. Perhaps, in spite of his wounded pride, he understood that leaning on me again, using me again, would destroy whatever tenuous connection remained. My mother spoke next, describing how she'd been re-evaluating her patterns of behavior. She admitted through tears that she'd become adept at spinning sob stories whenever she wanted something, and that it had been especially easy to do so with me. "I didn't realize," she said, her voice trembling, "how deep the hurt went. I kept telling myself it was just a family quirk that everyone exaggerates a bit. But Eliana, I'm so sorry. I see now that it was manipulation. I see how cruel it was. Her confession broke my heart and soothed it at the same time. I believe she felt genuine remorse in that moment, though I also knew better than to let my guard down completely." James, seated beside my mother, fidgeted with his phone. When it was his turn to speak, he glanced my way before clearing his throat. "I've been trying to learn from my mistakes, and I know I still have a long way to go. I'm not proud of what I did. I'm embarrassed to think about how we mocked you, and how I took your kindness for granted." He looked at the counselor. "Sometimes, I think about how different things might have been if we just asked for help without all the lies. But I guess we got so used to those lies that it felt normal." His admission was raw, a rare vulnerability I'd never witnessed in my brother before. It stirred a complicated mixture of pity, anger, and a faint, fragile hope. When the counselor prompted me for my perspective, I felt my pulse quicken. Even though I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, my emotions still tangled themselves in my mind. "I'm trying to move forward," I began, steadying my breath. "I want to believe we can rebuild something healthier. But rebuilding requires trust. Trust is earned by consistent actions, not just apologies in therapy or promises made under pressure." I inhaled, letting the gravity of my words settle. "I need to see that you all respect my boundaries, that you stop turning to me as a safety net whenever money gets tight, that you treat me like a person, not a transaction." A silence followed my statement, laden with the kind of tension that comes from uncomfortable truths. The counselor eventually broke it, guiding us toward actionable steps, a schedule for continued therapy, a pledge for transparent and honest communication, and a plan for how my parents might handle financial crises without involving me. This time, my father didn't balk or roll his eyes. My mother didn't burst into defensive tears. James didn't glare resentfully. Instead, all three nodded, as if they recognized the lifeline these guidelines provided. If they resisted, they risked losing me forever. Yet, even with these agreements in place, I didn't expect a neat storybook ending. Old habits die hard, especially when they've been perfected over years of practice. But I did notice small changes. My mother began texting me about everyday life, her new cake recipes, the neighbor's yappy dog, a movie she enjoyed, without once bringing up money. My father sent me an email with a resume draft, tentatively asking if I could help him proofread before he applied for new jobs. He didn't request a single cent. James, true to his word, updated me on his job search without spinning tales of financial desperation. He even seemed to take pride in shouldering his own obligations, sometimes mentioning how tough it was but how he'd manage. My own progress was equally vital. No longer was I tethered by guilt or the compulsion to rescue them. When financial challenges arose, whether unexpected car repairs or medical bills, I calmly reminded myself that I wasn't responsible for solving those problems, and that giving or withholding money wouldn't define my worth. I maintained a polite but firm stance. If they tested my boundaries, I repeated my stance as many times as necessary. It wasn't easy. Sometimes the old reflex to help would tug at my heart, especially seeing my mother's eyes redden, but I remembered the ache of betrayal, the lines in their group chat branding me as a naive family ATM, and stood my ground. Meanwhile, the first continued nurturing my own life, a pursuit that once felt selfish, but now felt indispensable. I added extra coursework to speed up my degree completion, fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. I also put down small roots in my apartment community, joining a neighborhood watch program, volunteering at a local animal shelter, even organizing a small potluck where each resident contributed a dish from their cultural heritage. These everyday joys, though mundane, shone a warm light on my future. Each new friend I made, each new skill I honed, signified a piece of me growing beyond the confines of my family's exploitation. Eventually, the counselor suggested tapering down our sessions, provided we each felt comfortable continuing our newfound patterns. For me, it was a bittersweet milestone. Therapy had become a controlled environment where the ugliest truths could be laid bare, yet it also served as my shield. Without those regular meetings, would my parents and brother revert to old behaviors? Or would they keep striving to be better? I decided to trust the process, but I also stayed vigilant. We scheduled an optional session every couple of months, just to keep ourselves accountable. At the last regular meeting, the counselor asked each of us to articulate what we hoped our family dynamic would look like in the future. James said he wanted a relationship with me, where we could laugh together without the sting of old wrongs. My mother dreamed of holiday gatherings that weren't overshadowed by tension. My father quietly admitted he was tired of living in shame. When my turn came, I paused before speaking. I want to feel safe with you, to know that I'm loved, not used. Whether that's possible after everything that's happened, I don't know. But I'd like to find out. That admission felt like the most vulnerable step of all, acknowledging the faint ember of hope that still flickered in me. Leaving the counselor's office that day, I didn't feel triumphant or euphoric, but I did feel lighter, as if I'd shed some invisible weight. My family was still in flux, and I was well aware there could be setbacks. But for once, the path ahead wasn't lined solely with dread. There was potential, fragile, tentative, but real for something resembling genuine connection. They had seen the full brunt of my wrath, the unstoppable force of my truth, and recognized they couldn't manipulate me anymore. In the aftermath, a new kind of dynamic began to emerge. I walked to my car, the late afternoon sun bathing the parking lot in a warm glow. As I turned the key, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My features still bore traces of tiredness, shadows under my eyes, tension in my jaw, but I also glimpsed a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The final confrontation had taken place not just at that explosive engagement party, but in the countless conversations since, in every boundary I upheld, every unflinching stance I took to protect myself. Confrontation was not a single event, but an evolving process of demanding the respect I deserved. At last, I drove off into a future where I was no longer controlled by their needs and lies. Whether my family and I would ever fully reconcile, I couldn't say. But I knew one truth with certainty: I was free to shape my life on my own terms. And that, more than any apology or monetary restitution, was the real victory. Thank you for sharing in my journey of betrayal and self-discovery. If there's one lesson I've learned, it's that our strongest bond must be with our own sense of worth. Sometimes the hardest fight is not against outside enemies, but against those we never expected would harm us. Yet, from the ashes of that heartbreak, we can rise stronger, cautious, but also empowered. Realizing I deserved better was the first step toward reclaiming my independence and emotional freedom. If this story resonated with you, or if you believe in the power of truth and resilience, please hit the like button, share this video with friends who might need this reminder, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that shed light on the complexities of family, betrayal, and healing. Together, let's continue to support one another's journeys toward dignity and self-love. Your voice matters, and your story too can inspire someone to break free.